Эта сессия как...
So this session, just like the previous one, was organized by one of the co-founders of the Valdai Club in its new shape. That's the Moscow State University of Foreign Affairs. Most of its participants are traditional partners, friends of this university. And I would like to introduce to you, first of all, academician Alexander Dinkin. He's a person who symbolizes a synergy and synthesis of knowledge in the area of global economy. He's involved in the research into the global economic processes, and as far as he is the director of the Institute of World Economy and International Relations of Russian Academy, he would be our first speaker today. Angela Stent. And actually, I can provide you with different text to introduce her. She is Professor of Government and Foreign Service, Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, but she doesn't need any introduction. And for several years, she is a guest professor of MGIMO, Frederick Council and Honorary Council for the Russian Federation in Lausanne, Switzerland. But he is also one of the leading Swiss and European businessmen who is operational in Russia, in the Russian market. And also Frederick is known for his support of the research programs and charity work. He is a member of the board of trustees of MGIMO. Tariq Hegi. He is our colleague from Egypt. He is a well-known author and political thinker, a philosopher, a person who combines his political investigations with the research into the most important question for the Middle East. That's the question of energy. Actually, traditionally, for Valdai, we'll have a 7 minutes deadline for the panelists' interventions, then 50 minutes for Q&A decision. And as I said, as far as we're not so numerous, we will be able to ask more than one questions each. When we spoke about leadership, and let me abuse my role of a moderator and take your attention for a couple of minutes, leadership was understood as a component of the international structure of international relations. We should think about the most important topic of our convention here, the New World Order and its rules. So we're not just speaking about who is the most important actor, who is the most stakeholder, but rather we're going to discuss the structure. So I suggest that we focus on the global leadership, on the regional leadership. Sometimes it might be evident, and in some regions it would be covered, it would be not so evident. For instance, Sub-Saharan region. Look at eastern, southern part of Asia, and you will never find an obvious leader there. There might be some sectoral leadership, or there might be some foreign political resources or leverage, such as availability of energy sources, or certain cultural heritage, or, for instance, military potential, or availability and possession of such things as nuclear arms. And those external factors or foreign political factors may serve as one of the pillars for the leadership. Third item which we should touch upon, these are the extreme aspects of leadership. Hegemony, is it a type of leadership or not? A leadership which was imposed to other stakeholders, or this is a forced leadership. Probably you could remember that the Germans used to complain at the end of 1980s, 1990s, that they were forced to become a leader, and now they have to drag this burden of the European integration. And then one is used to such leadership and may claim leadership which would be acknowledged and recognized by the neighbors. Item number 4, that's leadership and responsibility. And I'd like to get back to what Mr. Turkunov said at the very first session, at the introduction session, when he quoted from Saint-Exupéry that we are responsible for those who we have tamed. And usually that would be the leader who would tame his subordinates, but also he should take into consideration the interests of those he run, not to be ousted, not to cause any uprising, not to break the international system in this short perspective. Item number 5. Different institutions of leadership, and we as people, experts in international relations, think that this is one of the most important aspects. G20, G8, United Nations, any institutions of Bretton Woods system, are they appropriate if you want? Are they an appropriate attribute? Or are they an appropriate venue? Or kind of platform for the leaders, or we need other institutions? Because really, those institutions, they emerged in absolutely different conditions. After the leadership is institutionalized, we see two more problems. First of all, the law equality. And this is what we discuss usually when we speak about international policy. And at the same time, in the area of world economy, there is a legalized inequality ever since Bretton Woods institutions emerged, when there is a weighted voting, when the leadership in the state would be determined by the amount of gold reserves, when during the European integration, again, there is a weighted voting. There are some mechanisms to add some attributes of equality, but still inequality is legalized, so to say. And the final point is Russia as a leader. And let us look at that from different perspectives. The claim for the world leadership, whether Russia is a regional leader or a sectoral leader. And we may act in those several fields, actually, in the economic spheres, in the political spheres, etc. And having highlighted those items, I would not abuse your attention any longer, and I will pass the floor to Alexander Dymkin, who, in contrast to many other previous speakers, has prepared a presentation. Now he has a clicker in his hands, and the floor is yours. Artyom, thank you very much for your introduction, and I would like to thank you for invitation to participate in this panel discussion. I liked your introduction very much. Actually, we were offered to select between hegemony and responsibility. The answer is obvious. Certainly, we would opt for responsibility. But in order not to make this answer too simple, I'd like to stress in what world we are living, leadership in what world we are discussing. Such a non-contradictory description of the modern world would be very crucial, because on the one hand it would be an obvious truism, but on the other hand the mistakes made in the conceptual description would be too costly. Let me remind you a very popular idea of a wider Middle East. It used to be very popular in the State Department. I will not quote any names, but what we have now, 15 years after, we have a big Islamic state. This is an example of a wrong concept or a wrong interpretation of the concept and the outcomes. What is my understanding of the modern world? First of all, world is polycentric, is dynamic, is hierarchical, and it is obvious that the macro regions are on the rise, and the role of the regions is more pronounced. But let us speak about 50 years ago. On that slide, you can see that 2/3 of the world GDP was created in the Christian nations and in more than 50% of the Western nations. And almost all the policy was actually formed in Helsinki, in Potsdam, in the West. Everything was determined in those countries which produced the world product. I mean the GDP. Then 20 years afterwards, the share of the Western world is now less, and now such giants as Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia account for more than 1/3. And now, modern times, how it looks like now, everything has changed. Now the share of the world, of the West in the global GDP is less than 1/3, whereas the emerging nations account for 2/3 of the GDP. And certainly now the Confucian civilization, Islam, are on the rise, are no longer in the shadows. And Christian civilization has lost its dominant position in the world. And therefore, inevitably, the world should be polycentric. And I always shrug when I hear the word multipolar, because at school we were taught that there is plus and minus, for instance, in physics, and there is the North Pole and South Pole, and so there are only two poles, nothing more. But again, the labor productivity, this is a very important parameter or indicator. The United States certainly preserve leadership in that respect, so we assign 100% to them, but China doubles this very important economic indicator. And this is actually shows the dynamic nature of the Chinese economy. If we look at the GDP per capita, again, we see that still the United States is very much ahead of Russia and other countries, and only China is trying to narrow this gap. And China may approach the American indicators not earlier than close to the end of this century, and still this question is quite arbitrary. Now let us speak about the dynamics of the modern world. For 13 years, many countries made a real breakthrough. This is true of Russia, and that's what we discussed in the morning. Brazil made a breakthrough, India. And this is one more trait of the modern world, high dynamic rates. Russia, in terms of the PPP, the purchasing power parity, Russia is second only to Germany, and Brazil is trying to catching up with us. And now I wanted to show to you this picture of hierarchy. Certainly the United States remain the leading innovative financial, military, and economic power. Under the incumbent president, the United States almost achieved the energy independence. They account for a big share of the world military expenses. A lot of trade operations and transactions are denominated in United States dollars, and they invest heavily into the R&D. So what they lack today, in my opinion, in the 21st century, the United States lost their moral leadership, which was typical of them, for instance, by the end of the 20th century. This happened gradually, and I may, for instance, quote Colin Powell, who waved something which looked like liquid soap. And I may remember a long list of mistakes committed in Iraq when the institutional building there resulted in the fact that a Maryland traffic code was applied to that country. So, and it means that the traffic rules for Maryland were applied for Baghdad. And this moral leadership certainly was lost. And I mean also the tapping of the rest of the world, including the closest allies. All the Arabs certainly would remember Abu Ghraib prison, and therefore the United States lost their moral leadership. And now I think that the United States is losing its positions. China is on the rise. You can also note that I marked Russia and the European Union with the arrows of different colors, and the EU has a double-digit unemployment rate, the aging of the population. It is home to 35 million of Arabs who are not integrated in these nations, almost zero growth rate. Russia certainly made a remarkable breakthrough in the last decade, and now Russia faces the necessity to find a new model for the development, and it has several options. For instance, there are certain resources for the leadership. For instance, it is due to its natural resources, availability of mineral resources, and geographical scale, and multiple achievements in R&D. Certainly, sanctions are not handy, are not helpful in that respect, but there were examples when sanctions created certain pulses or certain preconditions which resulted in the change in the economic policy. Two examples, for instance, economic sanctions against China after Tiananmen Square riots, and so these events and these sanctions resulted in the change in the economic model and eventually in the economic rise. And 1998, 1999, the exit from the default situation by Russia when Russia had no longer any access to loans and credits. I was aide to Mr. Primakov at that time. And then we shifted the center of gravity to the domestic resources, to the inner resources, and based on that rather vigorous domestic policy, we managed to get out of the crisis within months. In my opinion, this bipolar or multipolar world order is close to its end, and it cannot cope with the dynamics of the modern polycentric world. I will not focus on those examples when those limits actually become obvious, and you can read that at home as far as the presentation would be distributed. The modern norms are subordinated to the values, are secondary to the values, and values might be interpreted differently. For instance, our minister quoted from The Economist magazine, and actually it would be a wishful thinking to rely on some universal values, except for probably the value of human lives. So these are the examples of, for instance, State Department's approach to secession. So in 4 cases, the answer was negative, and in 4 cases, the answer was affirmative, or the approach was positive. And it is very difficult to say that the State Department was guided only by certain values. For instance, the Golan Heights. They remain in the position of Israel, and Israel remains its closest ally. Northern Cyprus. The USSR does not recognize this territory, but newly elected President Erdogan paid his first visit to the occupied part of Cyprus, and no one paid attention to that. So, and we're not speaking about any values, we're speaking about the interests of the allies, and actually getting out of any crisis. And now a few words about the regions. On that slide, and sadly it would be very difficult to do that on the map, but it's quite evident that some micro-regions are emerging. Macro. And for instance, the traditional Asian-Pacific partnership and Trans-Pacific partnership, which is emerging. And so this is the Eurasian Union. And group number 4, that's the free trade area, ASEAN free trade area, and including China. In the upcoming decade, I think that those macro groups or areas would play a very significant role. And finally, and this is almost the end of my presentation, I think that we are facing a very serious intellectual challenge or intellectual objective, especially interesting for those who are involved in that. Let us discuss what will be the new norm, the new standard, and I suggest such 6 contours, so to say. And probably some of you will think that this is a step back, this is a deviation from the common values, and probably then we rather speak about the balance of interests. I used to discuss this question with Henry Kissinger, who was criticized in the United States for his book, but he is firmly confident that the balance of interests in such a polycentrical world is inevitable. And the last norm or standard is about the following: political or ideological pluralism. This is a new norm of the modern market economy.
Well, as other participants do not have presentations, then I will take this place once again. Everybody had a chance to see that the screen. So Frederick Paulson, when we invited him to participate in the session, we asked him to comment on leadership from the point of major business, who is quite often the one who determines the counters or outline of major countries and also political climate on the continent.
The introduction. If you allow me, my perspective is completely different. I'm not an academician. I'm not from the university. I'm a businessman. So my perspective is slightly different. So I've been asked to share my perspective on what should constitute leadership among nations in the 21st century. Given my experience managing global businesses for almost 30 years, my perspective is of course bound to that of a business leader. When considering this question, the first thing that comes to mind is that there are far fewer countries in the world than there are companies. There are only 193 countries in the United Nations. And, ladies and gentlemen, could you imagine a world with less than 300 companies? That would indicate a failure of antitrust authorities on a grand scale. So, what are the characteristics of good leadership in the business world? And, most importantly, are they applicable to the world of nations? Volumes have been written about the first question, and as anyone who's passed through an airport bookshop can tell you, there are new books coming out on this subject every day. Generally accepted qualities, among others, for a good business leader are, firstly, honesty. As a leader, your business and its employees are a reflection of how you behave yourself. If you make honest and ethical behavior a key value, your colleagues, your team will follow you. Indeed, trust is a key ingredient to a successful business relationship. Remove trust, clients and business partners will quickly disappear. A second quality is an ability to delegate. It is important to remember that trusting your collaborators with your idea is a sign of strength, not weakness. The key to delegation is identifying the strengths of your collaborators and capitalizing on them. This will not only prove that you trust and believe in them, but it will also free up your own time to focus on higher level tasks that should not be delegated. Another quality is communication. Being able to clearly describe what you want to achieve is extremely important. If you can't relate your vision, you won't be working towards the same goals with your collaborators. An ability to consistently demonstrate commitment is also vital. There is no greater motivation than seeing the leader down in the trenches working alongside everybody else, showing that hard work is being done on every level. It's important to show your commitment not only to work at hand, but also to the promises you have made. Another important quality is creativity. A leader can't expect all decisions to be clear-cut. Circumstances will force you to deviate from your preferred course. It is necessary to take time to understand all the available options and even be ready to turn to your collaborators for guidance. In this way, new approaches and better solutions are very often found. Last but not least, on this slightly amended list is the ability to inspire. Leading a business often involves looking into a future. Inspiring your collaborators to see the vision of success for them and where they can go is vital. A leader must find ways to help them feel invested in the accomplishments of the company, to share in the future success. So, honesty, ability to delegate, communication, commitment, creativity, and ability to inspire. I could create a much, much longer list, but I feel certain that these 6 qualities are among the most important for a good business leader. Now, the question remains, are these qualities of value when we discuss leadership among nations? For me, the answer is, of course, a resounding yes. It is my belief that greater honesty and transparency will not only attract greater cooperation among nations, it will also ensure that we do the right things. Greater delegation of responsibility within the world community will result in a more broadly shared commitment to achieving meaningful results. When a country's only task is to wait for a big nation to take action in its place, its commitment, even seriousness about possible solutions, must become weaker. So what about the ability to inspire? Humanity has achieved some amazing things over the years. But when you look back through history, you see that there are more examples on the national level than on the international. What would our lives be like today if we had worked together? This is a point which could indicate an enormous opportunity for the future. It is vastly more complex world today than it was 50 years ago. Many of the problems we face together are unlikely to respond to the solutions of yesterday. Today, creativity is the essential ingredient, not just in business, but in nearly every walk of life. The community of nations cannot afford to fall back into old habits. It must not allow the pattern of the Cold War to repeat itself in the 21st century. Do we see these qualities in the world leadership today? Sadly, no. Too often many of our leaders fall short in a number of these. But how can we change the situation? That's what we're here to discuss and explore today. And I'm looking forward to a stimulating discussion. Thank you very much.
Спасибо. Я думаю, что вот по тому напряженному.
Well, I think that by this intense attention that people were listening to you, this turn when that we took here of a business approach towards politics seemed to very interesting to people. Now I give the floor to Angela Stent. Angela is who is well known by the books and articles and a whole generation, several generations of political studies expert started by that, has become a classic of the genre. I think that she will introduce in our discussion a methodological approach and then we'll get to question and answer question once again.
11th Valdai. I like the new format, and I'll be interesting to see how it goes. I, of course, am a recovering Sovietologist, and I'm used to dealing with very concrete questions. And I was asked to do something more abstract, and so I thought what I would just do very briefly is to talk about the challenges that face different countries in the world in the 21st century, and about some of the different qualities and important aspects of leadership that could maybe help overcome them. When I thought about your question about who are the main leaders in the world today, I had a hard time coming up with a long list following on from what you said, so I think I won't be talking about that. We've heard about what the main challenges for the 21st century are. We have a rapidly changing global environment. We've been discussing that a lot. We have huge demographic problems, either with countries whose population is shrinking, others where the population is exploding, the imbalance between them, how more mature societies are going to deal with declining populations, with aging populations, and then these younger societies dealing with this burst of new populations. We have the constantly evolving threat of terrorism. We've heard something about that. It's something where we have to be very adaptable in order to deal with this threat of terrorism. There are conventional and unconventional military threats. We have obviously conventional wars going on, and then we have the issue of hybrid wars. And if you ask people, particularly in the United States or Europe, we would say that we are now dealing with a situation of a hybrid war in Ukraine. We can discuss why and how, but the question is, how does one approach that? And the traditional methods of the Cold War, or traditional thinking about issues like deterrence, containment, I think have been overturned, and that represents a challenge, at least for some countries in the world. Then, of course, we have cyber threats rapidly evolving. Again, we've heard something about that. So a leading country, any leaders in the 21st century have to deal with that. And I've just named a few of them. With every challenge, there are opportunities. Obviously, we have rapidly evolving new technologies that can deal with some of these threats, or not all, although not all of those threats. And we have great human potential. We have more and more people in the world who are rising up from poverty. We heard yesterday about how dynamic the African continent now is in terms of its growth. We have human ingenuity, which over time has always risen to the occasion, and so that really is our opportunity for dealing with these challenges. Now, what attributes and resources will it be necessary for countries to have if they are seeking a leadership role in the world? Military prowess is very important. In answer to one of the questions about Russia's role, the US role, clearly we are the two nuclear superpowers in the world, and those two attributes are one important element of leadership. States that have modern, well-equipped, and agile militaries that can adapt to new situations rapidly, they obviously are going to be in the forefront. They are going to be global leaders. But as we've seen in the last decade, in this century, in the ups and downs of US foreign policy, and Alexander Dinkin already referred to them, and others, being the militarily predominant power in the world does not guarantee foreign policy success. And certainly in the US case, we've had severe reversals. So the military side is a very important, but it is not sufficient, really. It's not decisive and will not necessarily be going forward in the 21st century. It depends how you use this military power. Economic power is obviously going to be a very important attribute for any leading state. Again, we've heard from Alexander Dinkin about the way in which these issues are evolving. And as we see with China, China is now the world's #1 rising power because of its economic might, and not yet, of course, because of its military might. And in order to be a successful country, clearly in the 21st century, the focus has to be on innovation, on technological prowess. That means a society where people can freely share ideas with each other, where in the case of technology, you have to be able to accept failure and then to pick yourself up and have the next startup. And then you need legal frameworks in societies that guarantee that these technological innovations can be implemented and can be absorbed into the society. Now, in the 21st century, leadership can be exerted either through the power of attraction or the power of coercion, or as usually is a mix of both. In other words, the balance between hard and soft power, which is rapidly changing too. And then we can discuss what we mean by soft power. And I would say clearly one of the sub-themes in this conference at Valdai is the declining role of American soft power, and we also heard that from some of our speakers yesterday and today. So, all right, if American soft power is in fact declining, or moral authority, which country's soft power is replacing it, or which group of countries? And I think this would be something would be very interesting to discuss as we look forward, because if you are to be a leading power in the world, you lead by example, and you have to have other countries that want to follow your example, that are attracted by your leadership style. And in the long run, that works better than coercion, although coercion can clearly, in some periods of time, ensure that a country plays a leading role globally. But the balance, I think, may change in the 21st century. Now, When I thought about the question of who's a good leader, who's a bad leader, how do we define leadership, I mean, it's clear that leadership is in the eye of the beholder, and different political cultures, different systems would identify an individual as a leader, whereas in other countries they would not be identified as a leader. I don't know if we can ever agree on all of that, and obviously we've heard in this Valdai and in previous ones the importance for Russia of a strong leader, of a leader who isn't necessarily too constrained by checks and balances. In other systems, strong leadership is associated with the ability to work with others and to work in a system where one's own power is constrained institutionally. So again, and there are a lot of other styles of leadership, and I don't think we could necessarily agree on that. I think the final point I wanted to make, if we look forward, we look at some of these domestic prerequisites or determinants of leadership, of how leadership is organized, is implemented globally. I think there's also the question of any system and how it arranges its own succession. So in a system, in a political system where there are clear guidelines for succession, this can certainly give stability and predictability to the population. And if it is a leading country, a country with a lot of power, if people know in the outside world too that there is a regularized succession mechanism, I think that makes it more predictable. In countries where there isn't such a predictable and regularized institution of succession, I think the possibility for dealing with, what we in scenario exercises like to call black swans, with unexpected and maybe catastrophic effects, I think that is more questionable. And so that will be another feature in the 21st century, is how do different countries and systems deal with these unexpected and catastrophic events. One of the things that, we're all aware of is the possibility of global pandemics. How resilient are countries and how resilient is their leadership? And finally, I thought that I would answer the question that was raised, who is a global power, who's a regional power. And I would say, for the time being, the United States remains a global power, a leader, because of its military and economic might. I would say Russia has global reach, certainly, but at the moment, it exercises most of its influence and its power regionally, but that could, of course, change.
Спасибо. И сейчас я хотел бы передать слово Тарику Хаги.
Thank you very much, Angela. Now I would like to pass the floor to Tariq Hegi, who represents the region, who demonstrated for a number of decades of the Second World War definite regional leadership, although it shrinks for certain periods of time. That is leadership in Northern Africa and in the Arab world. Sometimes it envelops the whole Middle East, but quite often this leadership gets to a much higher level, because Egypt has been and the leader and inventor of Arab socialism. Egypt has been the leader in the peaceful settlement with Israel, and because of that, it was denied the formal attributes of leadership when the headquarters of the League of Arab States was withdrawn from Cairo. It was the leader of Arab organization at the verge of the 80s and 90s. It was the leader of Arab Spring, and Egypt again is the leader in the positive understanding of this notion of counter-revolution. And how this regional leader represents itself at the global level. Tariq, the floor is yours.
My colleagues tackled the very large topic of the session from different three and most valuable aspects. So allow me to come from a fourth angle or fourth standpoint. I will focus on the notion of a single superpower. When anybody mentions a single superpower, most of the minds go to criticize the role of America. My mind goes to criticize the notion itself. The problem is with the notion itself. Whoever is the single superpower, we will have problems. But we will always have two types of problems. Problems related to the notion itself, and then problems related to the player of the role of the single superpower. And this will vary from a country to another, whether it is Switzerland, England, France, Japan, China. As a single superpower, we will have two groups of problems. Problems related to the fact that we have a single superpower, and these are much severer than the problems related to the player. America is, and with my great admiration to this country, is what Arnold Toynbee said, is a victim of its history and geography. But every other player would have had another problems. I mean, we don't know if this single superpower was China or Japan, what would have been the situation. So our problem is, in the first place, with the notion itself, with the concept. And then we have some added negativities from the nature of the player. But people tend to focus on the player more than the concept itself. And I think we ought to think of the notion and the concept itself. Was the world better with two superpowers? Very slightly. There was a relative role of responsible leadership within each bloc, but limited, inhuman, related very much to the bloc. America was much of a responsible leader to the very close allies of America, and the same was valid with regard to the Russia and the Eastern Bloc. So also migrating our minds to the Cold War as it was a paradise, it was not. So our problem is with this situation. Would this situation continue? I don't think so. I think for a very short while, few decades. Why? Because of the numbers my colleague just put before you. If a country contributes 52% of the GDP of the world in 1945 and now 19 plus or 17 plus in your numbers, I mean, we know what we are heading to. Maybe we don't know exactly what we are heading to, but we are heading to more than a single superpower. Would the world be better with two superpowers? I'm sure not. The world is in need for like 6 key players to make equilibrium between interests, cultures, different understanding to the world, and then a chance to input the values my colleague referred to. This is for me music in my ear. I come from 20 years with Shell International Petroleum, and I know that these values, I always say to people when they think of multinationals as spying, plotting organizations, that it's a joke. I was head of Shell in the Middle East for 10 years. I haven't seen anything of this nature. I saw the values my colleague referred to. This attempt to employ values of modern management techniques. This, I would claim that this is a good title for what you said. Modern management techniques rely on these values. If we can take some of these values to the 4, 5, 6 superpowers that are leading the world, I think our world would be much, much, much better. Could this happen? I think so. I see in the horizon, maybe in our lifetime, maybe not, that the numbers that we were shown assure us that by the end of this century, it is impossible that the USA will be the key or the single or the sole superpower. Let me now give examples of what goes wrong when there is a single superpower. You all have hundreds of examples, but let me shed some examples from the Middle East. Everybody who studied political Islam knows very well that the Muslim Brothers of Egypt is the tent under which an organization named Muslim Brothers Gaza branch was incepted, and it changed its name to Hamas in 1986. Our superpower, for reasons that we can discuss for hours, considers Hamas illegitimate and consider the Muslim Brothers in Egypt is the legitimately elected regime. Why? Because of reasons we can all discuss for hours, but it is such a paradox. The only power in the world that forced Hamas to sign a deal with Israel was the Muslim Brothers government of Egypt. Why? Because this is the umbrella of Hamas. Hamas was named the Muslim Brothers Gaza branch until 1986. And there are stories who changed the names, including an Israeli input behind the change of the name in order to take this to be a competitor to Fatah, the mainstream of the Palestinian resistance. What happened in my country, Egypt, is another example of this mess by a single superpower that has a problem with understanding others. When we had a terrorist group, in my view, called the Muslim Brothers, having one of their leaders elected as a president, was strongly backed up by Americans. When 33 million Egyptians took the streets asking for the removal of this government, and the army sided with them, America considered this coup d'etat. Another example of taking terminology from an environment, applying it on a totally different environment. Because the question would remain, if the army didn't side with the 33 million Egyptians who took the streets on the 30th of June 2013, if we had only these people in the streets without the army siding with them, what would have happened? Egypt would have been another Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya today. Egypt and Tunis are the only two countries from the so-called Arab Spring that they don't have the mess in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. Why? Because taking terminology from certain environment, applying it blindly on a different environment could be a big sin. Things are different. The so-called legitimately elected president, in my view, is a gangster from a terrorist group that he went to Pakistan and came back on board of his plane, tens of Al-Qaeda leaders. He brought them back to Egypt. If we consider this as a legitimately elected president and allow him to remain for 8 years, doing what he himself called it, Ikhwanization of Egypt, which is radicalization of Egypt, this is anything but taking a terminology from the shelves of the books of Harvard University, applying it on a totally different environment and reality. It is the same problem of not understanding others. So I believe, and you can talk about many things like this. Libya, Gaddafi was not the best leader on earth, far from. But do we agree to the way he was assassinated? Do we agree that Libya is better today? Do we think that there is Libya anymore? Is there a state called Libya? The same applies on Yemen. What will happen in Iraq and Syria? Is Daesh, is the Arabic name of ISIS. I hate it because ISIS is our goddess, the pharaonic goddess ISIS. So to call it IS for me is a double humiliation. Number one, because of the name of our queen, and because when you read it from the other side, it is Sisi, our president that I personally like. So it's a catastrophe. But ISIS, I mean, this is for me as a little boy, although I'm a Muslim, I have to side with Moses against Pharaoh. I was the exceptional. I was siding with the Pharaoh against Moses because the Pharaoh is an Egyptian, as simple as such. So back to the topic. We are witnessing a change in a very major concept that we lived with for a quarter of a century. And we lived with a similarly negative notion before that. But I think we are on the beginning of a fundamental change with this. It will take time. It will have many hardships. But I see that in 2-3 decades, we will have 4, 5, 6 powers that they have to agree on things, not one country. Nothing will happen like if America says in 2003, let me go and destroy Saddam. If the UN doesn't say yes, I go alone. I mean, the world will not allow it with multiple superpowers, but it will continue to happen if we have a single superpower because it possesses wisdom. Wisdom is possessed by one player, and that's why we have a UN. Do we agree that the UN is a real UN? is a full-scale UN, or it is a UN less a lot. Why? Because of the facts that started since 1945, and we are, I guess, at the end of stage 2 of this epoch or era. Thank you very much.
Спасибо. Мы можем...
We may start our Q&A session. First, it's Dmitry Suslov, and then our colleague from the front row, and then Mikhail Delyagin, and on. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their interesting presentations. I have a couple of comments and one question to Angela Stent. But first, let me draw your attention to the title of this panel, Leadership, Hegemony or Responsibility. This is a very colorful and excellent illustration of today's situation in the world, is that in the behavior of all centers of power, without exception, of the modern world, be it the global and regional centers of power, they have neither. We cannot ensure hegemony globally or regionally, and we are often very irresponsible. And this is a typical characteristic of the vacuum of leadership in the world. My second point, in European integration, there is an interesting term, pooling of sovereignty. If we bridge this panel and the very first session when we had Ivan Krastev, who spoke about the fundamental change of the very notion of power and how today even powerful states, countries cannot reach their goals, I think in this situation we can talk about pooling of leadership as the only form of ensuring efficient leadership in that non-linear, fragmented, complicated world in which we live. But for that pooling of leadership, there are a lot of obstacles. We see opposite tendencies. The number of contradictions is growing between countries. Fragmentation is intensifying in international relations in general. And Russian-US relations are another factor towards this movement from pooling of leadership in the opposite direction. But here I come to my question to you, Angela. One of the most important factors that prevent this pooling of leadership is the understanding of leadership in the US. Recently, in the US, they had yet another round of major debates. We read about it in foreign affairs and international security, when some said, okay, pull back or lean forward. And we see that the American political mainstream sticks to that point of view, that leadership is the only foreign policy philosophy in the US. There is no alternative to leadership, only neo-isolationism, and for the US itself and for the world, it's chaos. It was clearly manifested in the speech of Barack Obama and Camp David. But the world is changing, and to adjust to this polycentric world, which is not only polycentric but also polycultural, it's no one's world. So your question, please. We have 6 people waiting in line behind you. Okay, my question. In the US, how do they plan this adjustment, this adaptation? I understand it's very difficult to adapt to the world that stopped developing in the direction that's favorable for the US. But nevertheless, how is it possible to say that there is this third way between leadership and neo-isolationism? Thank you. Okay, let's take a couple more questions. Mikhail Delyagin, Natalia Narочницкая, and Vladimir Mamontov.
2 questions directed first to the entire panel and then to Tariq. One, we have a common now mainstream discussion in the world politics concerning the Islam, the emergence of Islamic groupings. Is better dictators than elected Islamists. Now, the question is, what is the position of America and what is the position of Russia? Which one you prefer, elected Islamists like in Egypt, or dictators which have been much more secular and much more, I would say, teaching dictators we had in history. My question to Tariq directly, the Turkish-Egyptian relations are worst ever. We don't have any diplomatic relations. Turkish president, prime minister, they literally still support Ikhwan, Morsi, and this is the only voice, if you want, in the Middle East, so strong against the Egyptian leadership. But the meeting of Omar Bashir and Sisi together was a big disappointment for the Turkish president because he was supporting a lot the Sudanese dictator, in other words. Now, my question is to you. Do you see in the coming years that there is an improvement either in Turkish position or in your position, or are you going to keep the distance wider and wider? And two leading countries in the Middle East, is it right? Or what is the zeitgeist, the spirit of time, in your view?
И еще вопрос Михаила, да.
Да, спасибо большое.
Thank you. My question is to all. It's a very diverse set of approaches. First of all, it's clear that the world is in this transformation period, leadership, irresponsibility. What is going to be the next configuration of balance? Bipolar system with China and the US and second-level countries that support the stability, or 6 to 8 countries of equal importance or something else? And most importantly, don't you think that when we talk about states, countries, we talk about secondary players in the modern global politics, because corporations play an even bigger role. When different officials, bureaucrats say, what do you want from us? We decide nothing. It's them. And they point to the side. They may be telling the truth, but they are pointing in the wrong direction, because business and interests of big global corporations are stronger than the opinion of bureaucrats in the governments, even if they are Democrats. Okay, Angela, stand to you first. You got a question.
To the question about how the United States will adapt to, let's say, its changing leadership role, its diminished leadership role, I would say with great difficulty. I mean, as usual, we have in the country, we've always had a core of people who are isolationist. I think it's going to be very interesting to see in our next presidential election whether the Republican candidate could be someone who favors a more isolationist policy. We don't know. I mean, that's traditional, but we're in a different world now because the implications of continuing involvement in leadership are rather different than they were in the last century, and there's obviously a growing sentiment within the United States not to be involved in conflicts in the Middle East, particularly since our energy needs, have changed dramatically. We don't need that energy anymore. So you have those countervailing pressures. So I think this will be a slow process of adaptation. I think it's possible that you can still have a somewhat reduced global involvement role without becoming completely isolationist, because the last time the US became isolationist, the consequences were quite detrimental. So, but as I say, I'm not sure how many people in the highest levels of the government are thinking about the need to adapt to this lessened role, because right now, obviously, we're faced with all of these simultaneous crises, particularly in the Middle East. And shall I answer the next question? Okay. Dictators or elected Islamists. What can I say? I mean, during the Cold War, we know that the United States had allies in, the Middle East that were authoritarian rulers, and this was, again, during the Cold War, and the Soviet Union had its allies in the Middle East that were authoritarian rulers. After the collapse, of the end of the Cold War, obviously the sort of democratizing part of U.S. foreign policy, which is always there, this element of, which is albeit selectively applied, but was certainly there, favored elections. I mean, it was, after all, the Bush administration that insisted on that election that got Hamas into power, and it was their desire. It was part of the freedom agenda, and we've seen that clearly in Libya, in Egypt. I mean, it's already been discussed. So the pendulum is swinging back now, and I don't think there's a clear answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Tariq.
Eric?
I'm not sure I can answer. It's about the U.S. But I think a theme which we could pursue a little bit more in the discussion is the, on one side, the leadership constituted by one person and the collective leadership, which I think is a very, very important question, which I hope I can get back to later.
Indeed, the level of tension between Turkey and Egypt is very high. I cannot answer your question before I say the following. As someone who wrote 3 books about political Islam, I do not see any difference between all the Islamist movements. All the differences are tactic differences, but strategically they end up with the 3 same objectives. The Caliph system, the cancellation of modern legal systems, and the reaching the 4 corners of the globe. In 2010, I produced a documentary on the Muslim Brothers for the Norwegian TV Channel 2, and I was lucky that the leader of the Muslim Brothers accepted to say something at the time. When he was asked, do you expect the flag of the Muslim Brothers to be above Buckingham and all the palaces in Europe and all the capital? He said, absolutely, it will happen. We will be everywhere. And even he said, Europe will ask us to rule. So when he was asked, how? He said, by the demographic bomb. We produce more children than you. And if you take the numbers, and he showed us some statistics, numbers in Sweden and in France and in England. And I live in between England and Egypt, and I know the situation in places like Bradford and Birmingham. Yeah? And I sometimes, because I have a great love to Britain, I ask myself, can they sit down on this bomb for decades? Can they live with this snake between the legs? Yeah. And yesterday, when I was watching what happened in Ottawa, all Islamist movements aim ultimately and strategically at the same 3 objectives. The tactics are different. So when somebody says Morsi was legitimately elected, I say yes. A gangster, a killer, a criminal is legitimately elected. I would see it that way. I can't see it differently. And I understand, I might be wrong, that Erdogan is part of the so-called International Organization of the Muslim Brothers. I might be wrong, but this is rumored everywhere in the world. They say Ghannouchi of Tunisia, the leaders of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, they have an upper layer above the Muslim Brothers. And these people have the same targets, as I said, and I believe that as long as Erdogan is leading Turkey, he will be very angry for what happened to Egypt, in Egypt. It cracked the word that he wanted to see. He wanted to see a different Middle East, a Middle East that resembles to the pre-1914 Middle East in a modern way, where Turkey was playing a certain role. Turkey can play this role, but with a political system that, in my view, matches with modernity. I don't believe Muslim Brothers match with modernity. I have in my books tens of questions. I will mention only one of them. Ask any Islamist, do you accept a Muslim like you and me to convert to Christianity? And leave it like this, from there. Yeah? And then we talk about modernity and values of modernity. And there are many questions like this, but this is not the time to go through them. But I believe that Erdogan is very hurt. And until this moment, I know for sure, the International Organization of the Muslim Brothers, they meet in 2 places, in Qatar and in Turkey. Why Qatar? This is a very important question. And this will take us to energy, because you asked me to say something. I, as an ex-CEO of an oil company, when I ask myself, why these four players are in the same vehicle? The USA, Obama administration, I shouldn't say the USA, Obama administration with regard to Muslim Brothers in Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, and the International Organization of the Muslim Brothers. What does Qatar do in this vehicle? A very small player. The answer is a player that has 27% of the remaining reserves of the natural gas in one accumulation. Russia, you know, has more reserves, but in hundreds of accumulations. This is very easy, very cheap gas to produce. I believe that in the head of someone, the Qatari gas is to replace and substitute the Russian gas in Europe, and this will be a bullet in the spine of Russia.
Спасибо. Александр Александрович, что-то добавить?
Thank you so much. Anything to add to this optimistic forecast? Well, you know, there was a question, what is better, an elected Islamist or a dictator? Actually, or a dictator. They are both bad, and so actually the monarchies were not so vulnerable to the uprisings and to unrests. Our foreign ministry was actually rather slow in reaction, and we failed to exclude immediately Muslim Brothers from the list of terrorist organizations. Therefore, I met them several times, and they are very motivated people, and they believed that Europe, this is the civilization of décolleté, so some medieval terms they use. And this confidence that elections are always good, but actually Hitler was elected democratically. This is a very difficult, sophisticated question, but such an obsession with voting, with elections, I think is not an answer to the challenges which we sometimes have to face. This is not a silver bullet. Once someone says that he stands for human rights and for democracy, once that's Mosio or guys from Benghazi who actually were bringing the light of civilization to Tripoli, actually turns out to be vice versa, when every cannibal who claimed himself to be the proponent of communism would be supported from Moscow immediately under the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, this is the situation which we see now, but the USSR is replaced with the United States. And as to the second question, this is kind of a Marxist statement. Exxon Company, it's a stable leader in terms of capitalization in all the ratings. And actually, it wanted to have booked the reserves of oil and gas in the Kara Sea, because actually the amount of reserves would influence the capitalization, but actually the administration of Obama turned out to be more powerful, so the company failed to do that. So, okay, let us have another set of three questions, and let me remind you that we have the panel dedicated to leadership, Professor Narochnitskaya, and two other colleagues. Thank you so much. This is unwillingly that I will start with my own ideas, and after that I will ask the question. I'm glad that these are the questions which we are facing, and I would like to highlight the fact that although economics and the GDP would play a big role, but these are not the only drivers for the history and for people. Actually, there was a question whether that action or motivation in politics is profitable or not profitable. I think that profitability is something which would bring profit, would be attributed only to something which by no means would be regarded as profitable. So this is the honor, the consciousness, motherland and homeland, and people who will sacrifice their lives in the name of those ideals. This is actually what differs us from animals. And Europe and the West is losing its leadership, which it had for many centuries, and it brought some dividends. It was profitable. These were ideas or civil liberties. This was a kind of a facade of the Enlightenment theory. It was backed by some Christian things, but this is not the question of today's panel discussion. And today's philosophy of globalism is not a globalization in its pure sense. This is about imposing of certain policy, which would actually promote the backwardness. And actually, my question is about the following. Does Europe understand, does the West understand that without preserving the moral values in the history, this would be the history of the end of the civilization, and all the values whose leaders in their lectures to the world would be reduced almost to zero. And there is an awful trend which I see in Europe, which will destroy and make pointless any ideology, any weapons, and anything. And the place of those leaders would be replaced by those who are ready to deliver kids without thinking about, for instance, utilities, who would eagerly sacrifice their lives in the name of some of their ideals. Double standards and treason to itself, or betrayal of one's own ideals. This is what I see in the West. All those certain drivers, certain factors which contribute to welfare, this is certainly good. I'm not a naive romantic. The categories of freedoms, of liberties, why the West would need that, whether this is in order to actually somehow promote urine, or to loot the enemies when you admire the dying enemies and kiss their kids and wives, or when you insist that freedom, this is to insist that there is no difference between sin and virtue, between lie and truth. So tell me, please, does Europe understand this? Does the West realize that? Do the elite representatives understand that? And I know that they do that to the population of their own countries.
Because you say that there's a lack of values in Eastern Europe. That's wrong. There's just different values. The values are not the same as you have. That doesn't mean they don't exist. The values which you have for a family, that's certain values which you believe are have a certain sort of moral standing. In many Western European countries, they have different values related to how a family should be. It's not that they don't have any. They have clearly defined ideas what is right and wrong. So that's a misunderstanding from your point.
Спасибо, Фредерик. Как я уже сказал, Владимир Мамонтов и...
Спасибо всем.
I would like to thank all the panelists for the interesting interventions and contributions, but I'd like to comment very briefly and jokingly the statement by Mr. Dinkin about that there are 2 poles, but actually the Earth has 8 poles, and they are very, very different, and some of the panelists know that very well. But really, to a certain extent, my question was somehow asked by Ms. Narochnitskaya. So the planet Earth has 8 poles, and once man do not interfere with that system, there might be some sandy storms and tsunamis, but everything is in balance. Once we see an intervention of the mankind, an imbalance would emerge at all levels. there would be so sophisticated and difficult relations that probably we will be never able to analyze them all at any Valdai meeting. So, and this is due to the contribution of the mankind that we see so much hypocrisy. As a reporter, I have the right to ask a naive question. And what did Buddha say? There are no simple answers to simple questions, and can we do anything about that? Do you think about that? And is it one of quite important factors which serve as root cause of many problems which we see now? Well, such a philosophical panel. Okay.
Serge Maiman, I'm from the International New York Times. I don't have too much voice. I think when both the last two speakers raised a similar question in different ways, which is what we would call soft power. And I think of all the speakers, only Angela really raised this issue and noted that this may be as important as military, economic. The title of the session is Hegemony or Responsibility, as if those are the only two components. I think example may be even more important. And whether people here like it or not, whether they would agree or not, I suspect that the United States still has the largest amount of soft power out there in the world. I noticed virtually all Russian participants here are in jeans, which speaks to that. And I think that this will continue to play a major role as we move on. And I'd love to hear Angela comment on what role soft power will play in America's competition with all the other rising powers. Maybe others will want to comment too. Thank you.
Что? Тогда давайте попробуем еще раз.
Okay. Let us probably once again answer the question of our American colleague and Mr. Mamontov. And I would say that cultural and other resources, such as negotiations and dialogues, will actually be a resource or value which would be possessed by a limited number of countries. Should the Soviet Union has such resource in the years 1920s or 40s, it was a first socialist country which could not only find some allies or some individuals attracted by those ideals, or it might be political Islam which would be attractive, or this might be an American way of life or living standard which is attractive for people. And then all of a sudden China is promoting socialism and political Islam is being fragmented. So at some time there is only one country which identifies itself with a kind of a resource. Alexander, was it you who spoke about different poles? Well, actually, certainly we can find 8 poles, and I heard that the Earth is backed by some whales and turtles, etc. We can discuss that for hours, but let me take the question about the role of the soft power. But actually, now people are speaking about smart power, soft power. This is a quite thin topic because it takes time and effort in order to build it. And probably several shots from Guantanamo prison would destroy the whole of soft power, because soft power is built on what Professor Stanford called power of attraction. And if you want to change this tool, you should be very cautious about how you would look like in the eyes of the world. I know that in Beijing there was a whole congress of the Communist Party of China dedicated to the Chinese tools of soft power, and big figures were quoted as to the investment of China into soft power, but the arrest of one dissenter would destroy almost all those investments. And certainly, I would like to say that soft power would play a big role, but I believe in soft power, a combination of soft and hard power. Thank you. Angela?
I'm trying to add a word, but Ms. Narodnicheskaya has gone. I would scarcely use the word nihilist to describe, the culture of the United States. We have the highest number of churchgoers proportionately, certainly much higher than in Europe, and I know higher than in Russia. It is true that many of these churchgoers now have a rather more inclusive definition of what a family is than in some other parts of the world, but I think I do not see, at least in the country in which I live, kind of moral decline and nihilism. It doesn't exist. I'm glad that Alexander Dinkin talked about smart power. I meant to talk about it and left it out. I think you're right, that is very important. But Serge, I still think, I asked the question, American soft power may be in decline, and of course there are lots of people who like some aspects of American soft power, be they Hollywood movies and other things, but actually don't like the politics of the United States. So then we have to discuss how effective the soft power is. It is in some ways and not in other ways. But I do not see any other single country that has the ability to project that kind of soft power. Russia certainly does in its neighborhood, in the post-Soviet space. It does have, and beyond that. But that isn't yet of global reach, and I don't think China is nearly there yet. So I still think that American soft power, until now, is the predominant form of soft power.
Well, if I may add to that, I think the comment you said about Russia can also be used in the context of France. France also has a major impact culturally in the French-speaking countries. It's a question of language. The English language is the vector that the American soft power uses to spread itself all over the world. It's not just the songs, the music, the films, the books. It's also, of course, the computer language. And as long as the English language is being used in this, the American soft power will continue. I also, this is my personal reflection, it's been very difficult to find another language that can replace the English, because English grammatically is a very simple language. It's very easy to learn. Almost anybody can, with 300 words, can express himself or herself in English.
I know that I will lose any popularity with my remark, but fine. What is the value of the American soft power if the popularity of America is between 1 and 0 all over the world or outside America? So what is the value of this soft power? Is America popular in the third world? Is America popular in Latin America? Is America popular in Asia? So if you have all of this soft power, which I totally disagree, it depends on the definition of soft power, yeah? If you have this and you say it is there and will continue, the question is, why didn't help the reputation and the popularity of America?
Спасибо. Теперь наши коллеги из Словакии, из Эстонии.
I give the floor to our colleagues from Slovakia and Estonia, and then, well, we see that we have a line of those who want to ask questions.
Urban Rusnak, I would like to ask you a question which is somehow to match the title of today's Valdai with the session we are just talking about. What do you think? I would like to ask all panelists, what is the relation between the leadership and responsibility and the need for the new rules? Do we need the new rules in a new world to address and to allow the leaders to emerge and to interact and to be responsible on the global arena? Or we don't need the new rules, and we could just leaders are those which would play the best the game without rules. And if we need rules indeed, then what kind of rules do we need? Shall we continue to evaluate to go through the evolution of the current rules and the institutions we have, or just abandon them and to try to establish a new rules, or totally new rules. We know that there's some group of the countries are looking for the new rules because they dislike the Bretton Woods and everything which was created after the Second World War. But is it a realistic approach? Would we be able to come to the common global rules just abandoning everything which was here accumulated over the last 60 years? Or we still have to try to modify them and to try to go and to find the right way how to modernize, how to reform them, to be able to suit for the 21st century? Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The panel has raised so many interesting issues that I have to exercise restraint, self-restraint, and to make two short comments or questions only. First, Derek Heggie said something which, in my opinion, is very important, that the problem is not with the United States being their only superpower, but with the very concept of a single superpower. And had there been any other states, let's say China or Russia, things may have been different, but they would have been quite bad also. Because a single superpower is bound to make mistakes, and there is nobody to tell it that this is wrong. So, and I believe the US has very few allies now in the world. The US has many subordinates which follow whatever the US line is, unfortunately. So, and therefore I believe in international relations, if we can speak about democracy at all, it is exactly balance of powers. And you said that there should be 6, 7, or 5 poles or whatever, centers of power, which really not only balance against each other, but which jointly, really purposefully try to organize things, most important issues in the world. Like in domestic societies, democratic societies, there is the principle of separation of powers. So in the world, if we can speak about democracy in international relations at all, it is exactly the balance of power, in my opinion. And now about leaders. Frederick Bolson spoke about qualities of business leaders, and I like everybody else probably these qualities. But don't you think that now things about political leaders of the world, they are not exactly, as some call, political pygmies, but they are not like leaders in the past, if I might say, Churchill, General de Gaulle in France, Ronald Reagan, Thatcher. You may like or not their policies, but they were really powerful decision makers. And isn't it that now we have in democracies kind of short-termism? Elections every 5 or 5 years, and President of the United States is very soon a lame duck president, and so how can these democratic leaders really think about long-term programs? Isn't, for example, the example of China now, when leaders are elected for 10 years, and they are pretty sure that they may stay there, that they can really take these longer-term approaches to most important problems. This is a kind of, I believe that current democracy has another problem in democracy is, of course, populism. And there is no much difference between populism and democracy. One man's populist is another man's democracy, of course. And therefore also I believe these are shortcomings of democracy where current liberal democracy can borrow from other societies. Thanks.
Спасибо. И еще один вопрос из этой серии.
Just one more question from this series.
Actually, I wanted to raise the question of soft power, so it's been done already, and I'm quite satisfied with the answer. But if I can ask a brief commentary from the panelists on another type of strange and frightening, to my opinion, type of soft power that we are seeing these days, especially in Europe, when young people born in countries in the only bloc where values would be, a fundamental priority, which is the European Union. They go to Iraq or Syria to join the Islamic State, and I say again, they were born in Britain or in Italy even, or in France. So between hegemony and responsibility, it seems to me that there is a risk we are underestimating this new reality and this new type, if you want, of soft power. So if you can give us a very quick comment on this.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I believe that was the comment and questions addressed to everyone on the panel.
I will just respond to what you said. The US has no allies. We have a NATO alliance, which has just been breathed, new life has been breathed into it by Russian actions. So it's alive and well again. It wasn't in such good shape beforehand. But it's an alliance, it's the longest lasting one. I don't know of any other alliance, any other country in the world that has these kind of allies that have stuck together through thick and thin. Now, you may not like it, you may not like what it does, and they're not subordinates. I mean, they're, to characterize it like that, really, I mean, the US spends much more on defense than its allies do, but it certainly doesn't treat them as subordinates. And as for, democratic leaders, should follow the Chinese example and stay in power for 10 years. I mean, the reason why in democracies this doesn't happen is because there's also the concept of accountability. And the reason why we have elections, and it's true if you have elections every 4 years or whatever, 6 years, you maybe can have the longer term vision. But if you start, acting badly, if things go wrong, people can throw you out. I mean, that's the principle of democracy. And, to quote Winston Churchill, it's the worst system except for all the other ones.
Okay,
Alexander
brought up the question of the relationship between power and leadership, if we need new rules. And then I think the gentleman from Estonia talked about the qualities of political leaders today. I would like to go back to what I earlier said. I think if you look at history and the countries which have been successful, many countries that have been successful have had collective leaderships. And even in China, during the fast growth rate, the country was effectively led by a collective leadership. In the country where I live, Switzerland, you can ask 100 Swiss who is their president, and probably only 1/3 would know the name of the president, because they have a rotating presidency. So the collective leadership is something which could be a way of answering many of these questions. There was also a question about why young people growing up in a democratic society which has values then suddenly completely change, become social and go to the Middle East to fight in these jihadist movements. There's always been a percentage of the population, I think from a sociological point of view, it's between 2 and 3% of the population which is social, who will never adapt to the main social values. That's something that has been in every society in mankind. So I don't think this is something unique for the Western societies today.
The comment on leadership. Well, naturally. Well, I believe that we encounter, what we see is the deficit of leadership in Europe, and the latest events testify to that. For instance, if there is one European country that promised us to deliver a ship to us, and it still cannot take a decision. I recently met with one of the high-ranking officials, asking them what's the current situation. Immediately I recall Maurice Schumann, French leader, and his co-thinkers who, right after the Second World War, managed to create the society of steel and coal that is European Union now, and put end to the 100 years of wars between France and Germany. I believe that was the outstanding example of leadership. Do we have leaders like that now? Well, I doubt. I do not exclude that in elections of 2016 we will see representatives of two well-known families, Mariam and Jabba. Comment on what is happening in Europe. Well, I believe this is the consequence of excessive puzzling of promoting of tolerism and multiculturalism, and Europe reaps the fruit of that. It turned a blind eye on exclusive Islamic communities, on Sharia laws being practiced instead of laws, local laws. European politicians wanted to use the electoral power of the migrants, of immigrants, to play into their hands. That's why there was no sustainable application of laws on them, but that ended up in a failure. Well, multiculturalism, that's something that is still going on, I think.
The world has two schools of progress. I'm sure you all agree to this. This one I call it in one of my papers on leadership, the slow cooking, which is the West, and the fast cooking, the Asian tigers. The Asian tigers, political leaders, are much closer to the values my colleague referred to. And they are more of chief executives, the political leaders, than conventional politicians. I think the problem of leadership in the world today is the need of the world to have a combination of the two schools. Conventional politicians, most of them today, are mediocre, elected by mediocres. And you need the other type, which is the high quality chief executives inside the politician. People who have these values, the values that make someone a better manager, power of analysis, power of imagination, leadership quality. We need to migrate these values into the world of politics. And if we look at all the Asian tigers, all the politicians were much closer to chief executives than European or Western politicians. The second one about those who leave, very important thing, because I said I live in England, and many the one who is slaughtering every time is from east of London where I live, because they recognize him from the accent. Yeah, why? I totally agree to what you said, but there is another interpretation. It is a problem, an amazing problem of identity. People go to Europe, the first generation, most of these people are not the first generation immigrations, the sons of and daughters of the second and third generations, and they have the identity problem. The ones who do very well, they never go to Iraq. The ones who don't do well, they go to Iraq and Syria. And this proves that Islamism is a poison that cannot be described as legitimate at any stage. It cannot. The person who's enjoying cutting necks and was raised in a public school in England. So you have terrorists calling themselves Islamist, and they come, and some describe them as moderate because they call themselves moderates. They come to European capitals, they have public relations companies. The Muslim Brothers spend billions of dollars. Why? Because they have money. They have the Qatari money. Actually, I hate to say this, I'm someone who went to the think tanks in Washington, D.C. like 40 times. There are some oily think tanks and some gassy. I mean, I'm not saying this applies on everybody, but the money of the oil and the money of the gas plays a role. Why Qatar is so influential? It is because of the money. Qatar has financed the airstrikes in Libya. And many things like this. So these people who go to join ISIS, they have a problem related to Islamism. These people, I mean, the West is on the edge now of criminalizing ideas. I know that people get shocked of hearing me saying this, but it will happen. The whole Western civilization knows criminalizing acts, not ideas. But Islamists will put you before a change in this. You will ask yourself at a certain moment, is the preacher at a mosque in Birmingham more dangerous, or the boys who followed his words and went to Syria? And you will have to have a new idea. Is it good? No, it is not, but it is imposed on the Western civilization by Islamism, that you will review that. You can't say, as we heard yesterday in Ottawa, the man was identified by the police. They took his passport to stop him going to Syria. What else did you want? Yes, you have, I agree, you have a wonderful legal system that criminalizing acts, not ideas. But now, isn't it time to look at a gray area between both of them, where ideas are as dangerous as acts? I think it is about to happen. Thank you.
Спасибо. У меня еще достаточно много записано.
Professor Cholani, Benami, and Mr. Makayan.
Attributes of leadership. If I could add one attribute that cannot buy leadership. Brute power by itself cannot buy leadership, because leadership by definition demands other states' respect, or at least tacit acceptance. If brute force could buy leadership, then schoolyard bullies would be class presidents. Doesn't happen that way. Leadership demands much more than possession of enormous military and economic power. It demands the power of ideas. You can call that soft power, as Professor Stent and Mr. Schienemann called it. But if you call it soft power, you run into the issue that Mr. Heggie pointed out, that the United States is not at all popular at the grassroots across the world, yet it boasts dozens of allies and strategic partners. And the number of American allies and strategic partners has actually grown in the last 10 years. It's actually specifically the power of ideas. The power of ideas to galvanize others, the power of ideas that provides the moral veneer to military assertiveness. The Cold War, let's not forget, the Cold War was won not so much by military means as by spreading the ideas of political freedom and market capitalism, ideas that helped suck the lifeblood out of communism's global appeal. If there is erosion in the leadership of the Cold War victors today, it is connected to the erosion in their power of ideas. If there is a major obstacle to China's aspiration to be Asia's leader, it is its lack of the power of ideas. China's increasing territorial assertiveness and muscular approach have only turned other Asian states against it. So the point is that at the heart of the geopolitical contest today is the contest over ideas. That will shape our future order significantly.
Your question, Sir Borghici.
I would like to make a correction and a remark. First of all, I don't know who said it, but that the United States opted for Hamas to be elected because they knew that Hamas would win elections. I think that's a wrong statement, because the United States at the time, and I was part of the whole process, was almost sure that Fatah would win the elections. And in reality, what Hamas got in the elections is 44% in proportional vote, while Fatah got 41%, and the rest of us got the rest of the votes. The problem was with the stupidity of Fatah, which refused to have a fully proportional system before the elections took place. And that's where Hamas got the majority through the seating in different districts. So I think it's a wrong assumption to claim that the United States knew that Hamas was going to win and supported that. Actually, it was the contrary. Second, I think it's not fair and absolutely unjust and practically even humiliating to put people in front of one of two choices, either dictatorship or fundamentalism. And I believe in many countries, fundamentalism is a reaction practically to failing so-called secular regimes who became so corrupt. And in reality, as we all know, absolute power creates absolute corruption. And that's why dictatorship is accompanied frequently with corruption. The problem we face, I think, in the world order today is the absence of common acceptable rules. In other words, the double standard. Can you ever imagine a situation where few countries would not recognize the election of the French or American or British president who is democratically elected because they don't like him? Of course, nobody would imagine that. But that can be applicable to countries, to developing countries, for instance, and maybe even to bigger countries than that. So I think the absence of commonly accepted rules here that would apply in a global world is the reason why you have ideas like maybe to encounter the fact that many countries would interfere in our internal affairs and undermine even our internal structures, is that to protect yourself from that, people turn to the idea of benevolent dictator. But that's also not a solution. So in my opinion, we have to be absolutely careful in touching on these issues. And I think the people of the world are similar. I mean, of course, there are differences and there are cultural differences and so on. But I don't think anybody in the world in general likes corruption or likes absolute power. And I think gradually the world has to accept the fact that all people are entitled to the same rights. You cannot discriminate between people. And I think here, and I insist on that there is a great risk in overgeneralization, because overgeneralization sometimes takes us to racism, and that is dangerous. Thank you.
Спасибо. Но нам придется...
But we have to generalize. Editor Makaran and then Professor Ben-Ami. And I have Professor Blow, President Chen, and one more professor from China.
Deputy editor of the French weekly magazine L'Express. I'll be short. Two questions, one to Mrs. Angela Stent and the other one to Mr. Tarek Geri. And I apologize for the two other panelists, but they can reply, of course. When I consider in the middle term the American-Russian relationship, let's say since the end of Cold War, and when I see how much the United States insisted on the European countries in the crisis of Ukraine to adopt sanctions, which are not the interests of European Western countries most of the time. Just a simple question comes to my mind. What is more normal from an American perspective? Was it the reset in vain announced by President Obama, or is it the present situation? Second question for you, Mr. Geri. Do you think it's appropriate to talk about a return of Russia in Middle East? I mean, there is not only Syria. There is, more interesting, there is the case of Egypt. That's why I asked you the question.
I don't know if this can serve as a consolation to the unpopularity of the United States, as was introduced by our Egyptian friend, Mr. Hagi. I think that maybe a brief historiosophical reflection might be the consolation. I mean, that has always been, throughout history, the predicament of empires. Albion became perfidious Albion when it became an empire. And before Albion, there was the black legend about the Spanish imperialism. It will always happen. This does not diminish the outreach of soft power or the benign effects of American power. It does not diminish it, but it creates the perception. It is enough with one Iraq war, one Abu Ghraib, or one wrong-headed support of a given state, sometimes Israel. We are twin brothers in this sometimes, but it doesn't diminish really the outreach of America. But it has always happened. Now, the second remark about Egypt and Turkey, you presented it as if it is a sort of ideological contradiction, clash of visions of Islam. Maybe there is a point there, I don't know, but I would add the fact that this is about a struggle for mastery in the region. It is a political, it is a strategic struggle between two major powers in the region. Egypt has been traditionally the main regional broker in the Middle East, in the Israeli-Palestinian situation and in other regional issues. And suddenly there is this newcomer that was snubbed by the Europeans and was in quest of a role in the Middle East and wanted to mediate in Hamas, in Gaza, wanted to mediate in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, has an outreach into the Gulf, into the Security Council of the Gulf. And that was for the Egyptians that were taken out of balance because of the Arab Spring. That was for them doomsday in terms of strategic considerations. This is what Egypt has to sell to the West. This is what Egypt has to sell to Congress in America, that we are here a power for good, for mediation, for brokering, thus serving in a way American interest. And suddenly Turkey appears. And this is the reason, in my view, for the differences.
Хорошо. Давайте, коллеги-панелисты, попытаемся быстро.
Okay, let's give our panelists a chance to respond to questions. And then I'll give them a chance to ask 3 more questions to those whom I promised. We're going to save time by skipping the final word. I mean, my final word, but the panelists have a chance to speak up.
To the one question about what's the normal pattern in U.S.-Russian relations. I know a great book you can read on this. And in the book, I describe 4 resets in the last 22 years. I won't talk about the Soviet period. 4 different resets, all of which have come a cropper, as they say, have failed. And so you have in the US-Russian relationship, you really do have a roller coaster cycle, ups and downs. What's more normal? It's hard to say because there have been periods in those 22 years, certainly, of cooperation, of high expectations. These expectations have always then been disappointed. The situation we have now with sanctions, obviously, we haven't had something like this since, I would say, before Gorbachev came to power, the kind of level of tension and using sanctions like that. I would not like to say that this is normal, that it's more normal to have an antagonistic relationship than it is to have a cooperative one. What is normal is to have a selective partnership where we continue to cooperate with Russia on issues that we've already heard about, be they Iran, be they some of the counterterrorism issues, nuclear issues, but where we have fundamental disagreements on other issues. So I think the normal is a very mixed relationship. It's just at the moment we're seeing the more negative side of the mixed relationship.
I have a brief comment about this question. I was reading the book by Professor Stent, a limited partnership. I was reading her book, and it's a great analysis and excellent conclusions. But unfortunately, and Professor Stent wrote about that in the New York Times, there is a deficit of professional expertise in the American circles that make decisions. The problem goes even deeper, not just the deficit of expertise, but the selection of experts not by their qualification, but by the level of their loyalty.
Yes, thank you. Ivan Blot, former member of parliament and professor of political sciences in Paris. Wanted to say our issue is hegemony or responsibility. And I wanted to say that man doesn't like responsibility at all. He doesn't want to be judged by other people. And when it's possible, people avoid to be responsible. And I think that in Western countries, especially democratic countries, you have a decay of responsibility of the political class. In our country, in France, for instance, I was member of parliament. I was too member of the administration in departments, civil servant, and I had probably 4 times more power as a civil servant as a member of parliament. And I think it must be the same in a lot of countries. So the power is in the hands not only of people who are elected, but of a bureaucracy, state bureaucracy, leaders of unions, workers' unions, or unions of businessmen. The power is between all these circles of the elite, of the political class, and the politics which is done by our countries is very often very different from what would want the people, except perhaps in Switzerland, naturally. But I'm not sure in the United States now the normal citizens want warfare everywhere for the American army. I'm not sure at all. But I think there are circles, oligarchic circles, who want it. And an American has said that for long years ago. It was President Eisenhower, as you know, about the industrial and military complex in the United States instead of democracy. And I think it's really a problem, because if you have more states who have responsibilities, who has the responsibility within the state? It is the people, or are they oligarchy? I think we live now in an oligarchic hegemony in the majority of the democratic country, and it is really a problem, because these oligarchs work in their sense, but they don't work always in the sense of what would be the common wealth.
Тогда мы можем одну из сессий Валдая, следующий.
Then one of the next sessions of the Valdai Club, we can devote it to the role of transnational business in international relations.
For international studies, I want to make a comment on American leadership. I know that despite of the different reading of the definition of leadership, particularly American leadership, but we all agree that we are suffering from the deficit of the U.S. leadership, or good leadership. The U.S. leadership is still very important. On many occasions, very vital and even indispensable. But at the same time, I think that the U.S. leadership has faced the dual challenges, both the home and abroad. And internally, I think that despite of the consecutive governments, president, senior officials, they have on many occasions publicly declared that the United States will maintain its leadership, global leadership, in the 21st century. President Obama has maintained that the United States will not be the number 2. But at the same time, surveys by surveys about those general public opinion about what kind of leadership the United States is going to do, whether U.S. will be, as its previous enthusiastic about engagement or involvement into the international affairs, that's quite doubtful. So I think that the challenge at home is how to mobilize, how to inspire the general public to continue to support the U.S. leadership. But more, I think, serious challenge comes from abroad. I think that we all agree that the hegemonic leadership is unfair. It's almost gone because it excludes the participation of other countries, including those rising powers. The challenge for the United States is that the United States know it is necessary to share burdens of leadership with others, but it's more easier to share those responsibility or burdens with its allies and partners. It's more difficult to share the leadership with those, particularly those countries who have different concept of order, both at home and abroad, or international order or domestic order. So I think this is the biggest challenge. And I'm not quite sure that whether the political culture of the United States, or the DNA of American political culture, would permit such kind of accommodation of those power who have a different conception of the order, international order as well as the domestic order, and whether it can accommodate that.
Thank you. And the last comment, question.
Thank you, President. Also, thanks for our colleagues so much talk about China. One thing, generally speaking, I think it will be long road for Chinese people. We should go ahead. It not means China and Chinese people like became the leader, original or globalized. I don't think so easy to do it. First thing, if comparison with the rest of the world, particularly compared with our Western friend, I think China's historical development really, it was very special. We haven't, for example, the tradition of civil society. We haven't industrial revolution. We haven't that kind of history just like religion reform. Particularly, unfortunately, Chinese people, we haven't so wonderful religion, just like a Christian. You have so that kind of the God, he could control everything. We haven't that kind of history. I didn't want to say China is exceptional, but that kind of historical heritage really very strongly influence on our modernization road. Secondly, one thing I'd like to introduce, after the new administration into power, one book is very popular. That is French historians Tocqueville's book. I know the Chinese translation name, The Old Region and the Great Revolution. General idea is that if you did want, for old regime, if you did want to promote reform, it will be waiting for you, the coming revolution. So even it was saying that the leader on the highest level, personally, he recommended this book. Finally, some years ago, in my university, organized one conference. Especially, I invited some of the professors from Germany and from France. I did ask them that what is your secret? That means after the end of the Second World War, why you so quick contribute so close partnership? The both sides, French and the German people, told me that I can tell you one secret. You can find our students' textbook.
when we, for example, in Germany, when we teach the students, young generations, our own history, at the same time, absolutely, we also deliver so the rich history of our neighboring country. I think that is a very nice approach for not only for Chinese people, maybe for also developed world. Thank you.
Вот так, 1,5 часа мы поговорили.
So this is how we spent an hour and a half. We spoke about the American leadership, and now 30 seconds of wrap-up to each of the panelists, because we are off the limits already.
The ladies first. They simply want to concentrate upon their thoughts.
Ну, понимаете, я не уверен, что мы...
I'm not sure that we killed two birds with one stone, but at least we know where those two birds might be. I think that leadership should not be soft, it should be smart. And ISIS actually proves that smart people have come to power there. They realize that three armies may destroy them in the Middle East: the Iranian one, the Israeli one, and the Turkish one. And they also understand that neither of these armies is ready to fight with them. Erdogan is now bargaining with the United States about his role in this conflict. And we should not actually speak about that in simple terms. They are not barbarians. Many people who are fighting there as rebels, they speak several foreign languages, and they are very good entrepreneurs, for instance. Therefore, people who stick to different values, to different moral standards, I think that they have to stick to smart power too, and give up certain differences and cooperate for the strategic objectives. Mr. Hali?
To my French friend, yes, the popularity of Russia in Egypt today is very high. The president of Egypt was here in Russia a few weeks ago, and the popularity of America is at the lowest level, and all of this related to what happened in Egypt between the 30th of June and the 3rd of July 2013. Those who insisted that what happened was a coup d'etat, like the Americans, have no popularity in Egypt, and those who accepted that Egypt was saved from the fate of Iraq and Syria, and Russia was among those, on the top of those, are very popular. And I'm not telling you secrets. There are already armed deals signed between Egypt and Russia, and financed by, amazingly, two Arab countries that believe in Russia today more than in America, and we should be all astonished of the two names, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. Why? Because they are against what America thought one day to be that the Muslim brothers are the ones who can play two roles: to control Hamas and to control the streets. And I believe both are totally incorrect. The picture portrayed by Professor and Minister Shlomo Ben Ami, my very basic Hebrew would allow me to translate and correct me the beautiful name, Peace and the Son of People. Is that right? Okay. Can be a name better than this? Yes, I totally agree. This is the picture. Very accurate portraying. But I am one of the opponents of Mubarak, all of his era, that refused to have such an alliance with the Americans. I always wrote that we have to have equal and balanced rapport with the Americans, Europeans, Russians, Indians, and Chinese, the same. But he was, Mubarak, a product of Sadat, who said, although I admire Sadat, that 99% of the cars are in the hands of the Americans. And even if this is the case, a politician wouldn't say that. What is left to you after you say that 99% is in the hands of someone? So Egypt should not insist on playing this role. I am the one to speak to the Americans. I'm the one to have the Palestinians and the Israelis in Cairo. Our main mission is to have a better society, to develop our economy, and also to have new alliances and balanced ones. Thank you.
Frederick.
Yes.
Frederick.
Yes, I was a little bit disturbed about the fact that one of the French commentators said that most people don't like responsibility. And that shocks me, because from the part of the world where I come from, that is, of course, something you take for granted, that people are prepared to take responsibility and exercise it the way they want. So I think this is a very, very pessimistic view on humanity, which I absolutely do not share. If you allow me to go back to the theme of today, leadership, I'm convinced that in the future we will see a change of leadership. Going back to the antiquity, dictators in Rome were appointed for special occasions. If the nation was at war, if there was some sort of danger to the nation, people got together, appointed a dictator who had all powers to solve this problem for a limited period of time. Today, I hope we are going to move in running nations to a more collective leadership, which will be run not by one person, but of course there will always have to be a primus inter pares, but there has to be a collective of technocrats that know what they're doing, or they should be elected for a limited period of time. That is my vision.
Very briefly, this was a panel on global leadership, responsibility, or hegemony, and we've spent an inordinate amount of time focusing on the United States, not surprisingly. So we've heard lots of criticism of US policy. We've heard that the United States is in decline, that it's unpopular. Then we've also heard at least one of our colleagues say we need more US leadership and express concern about the US becoming less involved. And we've heard from Professor Ben-Ami that it's the occupational hazard of any great power or hegemon to be criticized all the time, and one has to accept this. So this is the complexity of the world we live in. So I want to actually come back to your question about different concepts of order. One of the things we haven't talked about are, who are going to be the leading powers going on. Somebody talked about the possibility of a bipolar US-Chinese world. Now, I hope they don't mean that in terms of what was a bipolar US-Soviet world, which is a situation of antagonism. But if you said, okay, if you have two responsible stakeholder leaders in the world, let's say United States and China, to what extent can they work together given their very different approaches and understandings of both domestic order and global order? I think this is definitely a very interesting challenge, and I think that's also subject for maybe next year's Valdai panel.
Okay. Thank you all participants. Thank you all our guests. Большое всем спасибо. И у нас...
Thank everyone, and we have 10 minutes for a coffee break.